Road trips. They're something that a lot of people would have experienced whilst growing up. Personally, I have rather fond memories of sitting in the back of my parents' car as we drove to various car shows, racetracks, and occasionally the odd museum I wasn't interested in. But if, like me, you embarked on a road trip in the UK between the 80s and the 2010s, you will definitely remember Little Chef. They were an absolute cultural icon in the UK a few decades ago, but at some point they just fell off the face of the earth. But where did they go? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be exploring today. What happened to Little Chef? Our story, rather strangely, begins in post-Great Depression Kansas with a man called Arthur Valentine. Arthur had operated around 50 lunchrooms throughout the 1920s, as well as selling cars in a town called Great Bend. In around 1933, he began selling prefabricated lunchrooms constructed by the Ablar Hotel Supply Company. However, in 1938 they decided to pull out of this market, and so Arthur began making his own range of prefab diners with the help of the Hayes Equipment Manufacturing Company. After the war in 1947, Arthur Valentine created the Valentine Production Company and took over production himself. Valentine diners, as they were known, boomed in popularity throughout the 50s due to the creation of the interstate highway system. Many people bought and set up diners along the highways so motorists could pull over and grab some food. One of these motorists just happened to be Sam Alper, an English caravan designer and owner of the Alperson Caravan Company. Alperson had designed and produced the rather popular Sprite caravan, and when Sam was visiting the USA to promote his products, he stopped off at one of these roadside diners in Oklahoma. Funnily enough, the particular model of diner he saw was called the Little Chef. Anyways, Alper was inspired, and he realised that with the increase in car ownership and the first motorways being built in the UK, motorists would need somewhere to rest and eat. And so, once he got back to England, he and catering manager Peter Merchant teamed up to design their own roadside cafe. The first Little Chef opened in 1958, in the car park of an old cinema on Oxford Road in Reading. It was a small prefabricated building with just 11 seats. But despite its small size, it was quite popular, and soon Little Chefs began to pop up all over Britain's A-roads, and due to the lack of competition, they were quite successful. 2 years later, in 1960, Little Chef became part of the Trust House Group, and it continued growing, reaching 12 locations by 1965, including one in Regent's Park. This location in particular was rather popular, so popular in fact that it required expanding. However, John Gardner Caterers, a subsidiary of Trust House, took over the management of Little Chef from Peter Merchant and decided to rename the Regent's Park location to The Rose Garden, as they believed it shared very little with the roadside cafe. Anyways, Little Chef continued to grow, reaching 44 locations by 1970. However, Little Chef's monopoly on the roadside cafe market was about to come to an end. The Trust House Group merged with the Fort Group to become Trust House Fort. However, two key people left the company: Alan Jones, the former Little Chef managing director, and Michael Pickard, the former managing director of Trust House. Alan Jones wanted to create his own chain of roadside cafes called Mr. Chef. However, Little Chef got involved and said, "Oh no you don't, you little bugger," and so Jones's new cafe chain would be called Welcome Break. However, Alan Jones wasn't the only one setting up a new restaurant chain, as Michael Pickard founded Happy Eater in 1973. Happy Eater was a much more family-orientated restaurant, with badges and hats for the kids as well as an exterior play area. Happy Eater had similar menu items to Little Chef, such as a cooked breakfast, fish and chips, and a kids' meal called Little Porkers, which sounds vaguely sexual and potentially a bit noncy. Anyways, Happy Eater and Welcome Breaks joined forces to take on Little Chef, with most Welcome Break locations being rebranded as Happy Eaters. Meanwhile, Little Chef were expanding rapidly, as they had found a way to bypass the strict planning laws. Trust House Fort would send out representatives to existing roadside cafes and offer the owners large sums of money to move out within the week so their restaurants could be rebranded as Little Chefs. This scheme meant that Little Chef had 100 locations by 1972, expanding to 174 by 1976. The following year, the Queen celebrated her Silver Jubilee, and so Little Chef decided to celebrate in the best way possible: pancakes. They introduced their iconic Jubilee pancakes, a stack of pancakes filled with cherry sauce. I've never had them, so can't confirm if they're good or not, but if you have, please do let me know. Anyways, by 1980, Happy Eater were taken over by the Imperial Group, who started putting locations in motorway service stations. Truss House Fort followed suit by adding Little Chefs to their own motorway service stations, with the first being at Truss House Fort Motorway Services in Charnock Richard on the M6, located in a bridge for some reason. In 1986, Truss House Fort purchased Welcome Break and Happy Eater from Imperial. They continued running Happy Eater alongside Little Chef and rebranded all of their existing motorway service stations as Welcome Breaks. Once again, Alan Jones decided not to be part of this, and so he and Jane Pickard, Michael's wife, left the company to start their own restaurant, the AJ's Family Restaurant. Little Chef continued to grow, reaching 343 restaurants by 1990. In 1994, the Winter Olympics happened in Norway, and so Little Chef celebrated this by introducing potentially their most iconic menu item, the Olympic breakfast. A mix of bacon, eggs, sausages, mushrooms, tomatoes, fried bread and sautéed potatoes, it was an instant favourite. However, despite this popular new menu item, a new competitor was emerging, the fast food restaurant. In the 90s, McDonald's began opening locations in motorway service stations, offering food that was quicker and cheaper. To combat this, Little Chef opened their own fast food style restaurant, the Little Chef Express. However, these weren't hugely popular and only about 4 or 5 were ever opened. In 1996, Granada plc mounted a hostile takeover of Truss House Fort. The Welcome Break brand was sold off and Happy Eater was discontinued, but Little Chef grew exponentially. Granada opened new locations in their own motorway service stations, as well as transforming old Happy Eater restaurants into Little Chefs. This meant by the end of the 90s, Little Chef had almost 440 locations. However, financial difficulties would mean that a few of these would have to close. In the year 2000, Granada merged with Compass Group, before changing their mind and demerging a year later, with Little Chef now the property of Compass, who owned the restaurant until 2002 when they sold it to Permira, or whatever. 2 years later, Little Chef announced they were changing their logo in order to bring the restaurant into the 21st century. However, this was cancelled after 15,000 people complained. Also in 2004, Little Chef near St Helens was featured in the season finale of Max and Paddy's Road to Nowhere, in which this iconic scene happened.
What's yours?
No, you're not. Get that fucking cooker on.
I know this isn't relevant to our story whatsoever, but I just wanted an excuse to play that clip because it's funny. Anyways, throughout the 2000s, Little Chef began to struggle, with restaurant numbers dipping to just 234 in 2005. In October of that year, the chain was sold to the People's Restaurant Group, who planned to revitalise the company, but this didn't really go well, and by Christmas 2006, Little Chef was facing administration. But then a Christmas miracle occurred. Little Chef was rescued from administration by venture capital group R Capital. However, 38 of the 235 restaurants were not included in the sale, and therefore were forced to close. Despite being rescued, Little Chef was still in need of help, and so Michelin star chef, inventor of the triple cooked chips, and owner of many restaurants including the Fat Duck, which I keep reading as the Fat Fuck, Heston Blumenthal agreed to help revamp the chain in his 2009 documentary Big Chef Takes on Little Chef. Blumenthal visited a location in Popham and improved its decor and menu, adding new items such as ox cheek and clam shank. These updates were rather successful, and so 2 other sites in York and Kettering were updated in this style. However, despite this, Little Chef's restaurant numbers were still declining, dipping to 162 in 2010. In order to further improve things, they decided to update their logo from this to this, but this wasn't enough, and throughout 2002, Little Chef would have to close over 80 restaurants, with just 78 remaining. However, 3 more did later open. Little Chef was put up for sale in 2013 and was bought by the Coot Food Group. They planned to revitalise the restaurant but ended up closing 8 restaurants, before the company was put up for sale once more in 2016. The 70 sites were purchased by Euro Garages, with the Coot Food Group retaining the rights of the Little Chef brand but giving Euro Garages a 1-year licence to continue using the name. Unfortunately, this would be the beginning of the end for Little Chef, as Euro Garages wanted to convert all remaining sites into other restaurants such as Starbucks, Greggs or Subway. The licence ran out by the end of January 2018 and Little Chef was officially dead. Although not all of the locations had been converted, and so remaining Little Chef sites had to be rebranded as EG Diners, but by the end of the year, all of these had either closed or been converted. I find the death of Little Chef rather sad. For many people, Little Chef represents the time to which we shall never return. We will never again be sat in the back of our parents' car, gazing at the glowing red sign as we pull into the car park. In some ways, the death of Little Chef is a metaphor for the death of childhood. Gone is the bright red colourful decor replaced with grey, corporate-looking Greggs and Starbucks. With the dominance of fast food restaurants, it's unlikely we'll ever see another Little Chef, and so the restaurant is cast to the annals of British motoring history. Anyway, that is it from me today. If you did enjoy, please go down below, leave a like, maybe even subscribe. Also follow my Twitter @AutoAdmiration, and I do hope to see you next time. Goodbye.